When does a person cease to be a person and become property? It is not a philosophical question. For the Mongol Empire, it was a legal and logistical one, answered with brutal efficiency in the smoking ruins of a conquered city. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together of the Mongol Empire. The story of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol sub-kingdom that would come to rule Persia, begins not just with the sword, but with the ledger. When Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, crossed the Oxus River in 1256, he unleashed a campaign that would extinguish the caliphate in Baghdad and shatter the mountain strongholds of the assassins. But this was not mere barbarian rampage. It was a systematic harvest. The Mongol conquests operated on a terrifyingly simple legal principle, derived from the Great Yasa, or Code of Law. A city that surrendered upon the first summons might be spared, its population integrated and taxed. But a city that resisted, its population, by Mongol law, forfeited everything: their lives, their property, and their bodies. They were no longer subjects. They were spoils. When we consult the primary sources, such as the chronicles of Atamalik Juvaini or Rashid al-Din, they paint a chillingly bureaucratic picture of the aftermath. After the sack of a city like Baghdad in 1258, the surviving population was driven out into the plains. Here, the sorting began. This wasn't the chaotic looting of a disorganized rabble. This was a state-level resource allocation managed by Darugachi, Mongol overseers, and their scribes. This is where we must deconstruct a pervasive myth, that the Mongols were simple nomads who only valued plunder and pasture. The Ilkhanate proves this false. Hulagu and his successors intended to rule Persia, and to rule, they needed to build an economy. They inherited the sophisticated bureaucratic traditions of the Persians, but they also inherited a land of vast, untapped mineral wealth. The mountains of Azerbaijan, Khorasan, and the regions bordering Anatolia were rich in silver, copper, iron, and turquoise. This created an immediate and immense logistical problem, a massive demand for labor. The Mongol warriors were an elite military caste. They would not soil their hands with picks and shovels. The local peasant populations were either decimated, enslaved, or had fled the advancing armies. The solution lay in the terrified crowds huddled outside the city walls. Here, we must analyze the legal classifications that were applied. The captives were broadly sorted. The artisans, the craftsmen, the weavers, blacksmiths, and architects, they were often spared immediate death. They became a distinct class of unfree labor, the Hastan, or people of the fold. They were valuable, state-owned assets, often deported to work on grand imperial projects or assigned to the estates of the Mongol Noyan, the military nobility. But the others, the unskilled, the able-bodied, the men and women whose only asset was their strength, they were classified differently. They became boghull, or chattel slaves. Their legal personhood was extinguished. They were inventoried, branded, and chained. Let's linger on that moment of sorting. Imagine the scene, as described by contemporary observers. Families are separated with bureaucratic indifference. A hand that shows the calluses of a farmer is shoved in one direction. A strong back is marked for another. This wasn't chaos. It was an audit. The legal term for this captive population, Aesir, becomes a fixed category in Ilkhanate financial records. They are assets listed alongside livestock and grain, and their destination was preordained. The Ilkhanate needed silver to mint its currency, the dirham, to pay its armies and stabilize its new realm. It needed iron and copper for the weapons and armor of its war machine. The demand was insatiable. Thus, the legal framework of the Yasa directly fed the economic function of the state. The conquest was not just an act of war. It was an act of resource acquisition, and the primary resource acquired was human life. These columns of the enslaved marched under guard for hundreds of miles to the remote, bleak mining districts where the first and most terrible price of the Ilkhanate's foundation. Their chains were forged from law long before they were forged from iron. They were the silent, anonymous workforce destined to power this new empire from beneath the earth, erased from the dynastic histories, but forming the very bedrock of the state. The mines of the Ilkhanate were not sophisticated enterprises. They were wounds blasted into the earth, dark, unventilated shafts that followed volatile seams of copper and silver. When the columns of Aesir, the captives, arrived, they were stripped of the last vestiges of their former lives. Their names, their clothes, their social connections. They were organized into work gangs, often under the supervision of a darugachi, or a local client ruler who had sworn fealty to the Khan. Their legal status as boghole, or chattel, was now absolute. They were, in the cold, economic language of the Ilkhanate registers, a consumable. We must be precise here. The economic machinery of the Ilkhanate was a hybrid. It combined the nomadic, plunder-based economy of the steppe with the sophisticated, sedentary taxation systems of Persia. The mines were a critical nexus of both. The minerals extracted were not simply for symbolic wealth. They were the raw material for the Ilkhanate's survival. Silver was needed to pay the Mongol Tama, the standing armies, and to stabilize the new dirham coinage that legitimized Ilkhanate rule. Copper and iron were the lifeblood of the Karkhana, the state workshops, producing the armor, arrowheads, and lamellar plates for the unceasing military campaigns against the Mamluks to the south and the Golden Horde to the north. This demand created a system of terrifying, brutal efficiency. When we analyze the function of this labor, we find it divorced from any concept of human preservation. An artisan in a city workshop, a Haztan, had value. If he died, his skill was lost. A miner, however, was treated as a fungible asset. His only value was the raw physical labor he could provide before he expired. Records are scarce, but archaeological evidence from similar period mines, combined with accounts of Mongol labor practices elsewhere, suggests a life expectancy measured in months, not years. Malnutrition, disease, rockfalls, and the ever-present brutality of the overseers ensured a constant, horrifying turnover. This is the very definition of systemic oppression, a legal and economic structure designed to extract maximum value from a human life while investing the absolute minimum in its survival. The system was designed to be perfect, a one-way flow of human energy transformed into mineral wealth. But it was not perfect, because at the bottom of those shafts, In the suffocating darkness, the bog hole were still human. And this is where the Silent Revolt began. Deprived of all weapons, all rights, and all hope of conventional rebellion, the enslaved laborers of the Ilkhanate mines began to fight a different kind of war. It was a war of whispers, of hidden acts, of collective, anonymous resistance. It was a war of sabotage. We must analyze this resistance not as sporadic acts of anger, but as a calculated underground campaign. The primary sources, the official Ilkhanate chronicles, do not speak of this. Why would they? Rashid al-Din was writing a history of khans and dynasties, not of the anonymous slaves who powered them. But when we cross-reference these official histories with administrative complaints, with requisition logs for new tools, and with the basic principles of human psychology, a clear picture of this silent revolt emerges. Let us consider the simplest and most common weapon, the tool. An iron pickaxe head or a sturdy shovel was a valuable commodity, forged in a state workshop and transported at great cost to these remote mountain sites. To the slave, it was both his burden and his opportunity. A pickaxe that accidentally strikes a hard rock seam at the wrong angle, shattering its tip. A shovel handle, already stressed, that unexpectedly snaps under a heavy load. We must frame this moment. An overseer, a Turkic or Mongol nukur, responsible for his gang's quota, discovers the broken tool. He is faced with a choice. He knows, or at least suspects, the act was deliberate. But how can he prove it? The slave, covered in dust and feigning exhaustion, will claim it was an accident. To execute the slave is to lose a body, to fall behind on the quota, and to face the wrath of his own superior. To let it pass is to invite more. The response was likely a brutal, summary lashing, but the slave had won. He had cost the Ilkhanate a tool. He had stolen minutes, perhaps hours, of rest while a replacement was fetched. He had asserted his will. Now, multiply this. Imagine this single, subtle act of defiance repeated a dozen times a day, across multiple mining camps. The logistical drag on the Ilkhanate's mineral supply becomes significant. The cost of replacement tools, the lost man-hours, the friction in the administrative chain. This was a genuine economic assault. But the sabotage went far deeper. The most potent weapon was not the broken tool, but the slowed hand. The Mongols, like all effective administrators, operated on quotas. Each gang was expected to deliver a certain weight of ore to the surface by the end of the day. Failure meant punishment for everyone. The resistance lay in a collective, unspoken agreement. The gangs would work, but they would work at the slowest possible pace that did not trigger a mass beating. This is a far more sophisticated form of resistance. It required social cohesion, communication, and immense self-control. New slaves, desperate and terrified, would have to be quickly and silently initiated. We do not run, we walk. We do not fill the basket to the brim. When we read the, admittedly sparse, accounts of overseers complaining of the innate laziness or sullenness of their captive workforce, we are likely not reading an objective assessment of their character. We are reading the frustrated report of a man who is failing to meet his quota because his workforce is engaged in a conspiracy of deliberate inefficiency. They were slowing the entire machine. This war of whispers had other fronts. Ore carts would be loaded with a layer of high-grade ore on top, concealing worthless rock and debris beneath. Timber supports, essential for preventing tunnel collapses, would be set just slightly off-center, or their joints weakened in ways invisible to a cursory inspection, ensuring a minor rockfall that would halt work in a gallery for days. Warning calls of an approaching overseer, disguised as coughs or work chants, would echo down the tunnels, giving slaves a moment to rest or to cease a more blatant act of sabotage. This was not a revolt for freedom. For most, escape from a guarded mine in the middle of a hostile foreign territory was an impossibility. This was a revolt for agency. It was an assertion of humanity against a legal and economic system that had defined them as animals, as tools, as numbers on a ledger. It was a way to fight back, to inflict a cost, however small, on the empire that had stolen their world. The Ilkhanate administration, inheriting centuries of Persian bureaucratic experience, was not naive. They recognized the patterns. They understood the economic drain. The silent, scattered acts of sabotage were met not with systemic reform, but with escalating localized terror. This secret war, fought in the darkness of the pits, was about to provoke a brutal response from the surface. The masters of the ill database, the Mongol Noyan, would not tolerate this friction in their great machine of war and wealth. The whispers were about to be answered with a scream. The Ilkhanate's response to this war of whispers was not one of negotiation or reform. It was an act of brutal, systemic re-engineering. The Noyan and Daragachi, who managed the mines for the central treasury or for their own vast estates, recognized the economic drain. Their countermeasures were not designed to punish individuals. A slave was, after all, a replaceable asset, but to shatter the social cohesion that made the Silent Revolt possible. The whispers would be answered with a scream. The primary tool, borrowed directly from the Mongol military machine, was collective responsibility. The decimal system that organized the Mongol army into units of 10, Arban, 100, Jaghun, and 1,000, Mingan, was built on a simple, terrifying principle. If one soldier fled, his entire unit of 10 was executed. This legal doctrine was now imported from the battlefield to the mine shaft. When we analyze how this was applied, the cold logic is horrifying. Slaves were organized into fixed work gangs, often of 10 to 20 men. If a tool was broken, if a quota was missed, if a timber support slipped, the entire gang was held accountable. This was not a summary beating for one man. It was the withholding of food rations, already at subsistence levels, for the entire group. It was the selection of one man at random from the group for a public, fatal example. This policy was a brilliant, malevolent piece of psychological warfare. It was designed to turn the slaves against one another, to make the cost of one man's sabotage an immediate, unbearable threat to his companions. The slow-down conspiracy could no longer function if the man next to you, starving, saw your deliberate slowness as a threat to his own life. The bonds of shared suffering were deliberately targeted and severed, replaced by a forced, desperate paranoia. Alongside this, the quotas were weaponized. They were increased to levels that were not just difficult, but physiologically impossible to maintain over time. This fundamentally changed the slave's calculation. The choice was no longer between a slow pace and a fast pace. The choice was now between working oneself to death in a matter of weeks or being beaten to death in a matter of hours. The slowdown became a form of suicide, and the collective will to resist fractured under this relentless, engineered despair. We also see in the administrative responses a move toward increased stratification. The Ilkhanate, ever pragmatic, began to create a class of collaborators within the enslaved population. A slave who showed loyalty or who was willing to inform on his fellows might be promoted to a capo, a gang foreman. He would receive slightly more food, slightly better treatment, and the most valuable prize of all, a marginally higher chance of survival. His job was to enforce the quota, to spot the saboteur, to break the will of his own people. The Silent Revolt was now forced to contend with an internal police force born of its own ranks. The Ilkhanate's countermeasures were, in the short term, ruthlessly effective. The flow of silver, copper, and iron resumed. The war machine was fed. The coins were minted. The anonymous, whispered war was seemingly lost. So, what is the legacy of this revolt? When we consult the grand histories of the age, the Jami al-Tawarikh of Rashid al-Din, or other state-sponsored chronicles, there is no mention of it. These slaves are absent from history. They are the human cost, the invisible ink on the balance sheets of the empire. Their resistance, their names, and their suffering were buried with them in the spoil heaps. This is where we, as historical investigators, must look beyond the official record. The legacy of the Silent Revolt is not a glorious victory. It is not a revolution that changed the course of the Ilkhanate. Its legacy is more profound. It is the definitive proof of an indomitable human agency. We must debate what success means in this context. If success is liberation, they failed. But if success is the assertion of one's humanity against a system designed to eradicate it, then every broken tool, every minute stolen, every shovelful of worthless rock was a victory. The Ilkhanate, with its vast armies and its absolute legal power, defined these people as boghole, as property, as animals. But the slaves, through their collective action, refused this definition. They insisted, in the only way left to them, that they were still men, that they had will, and that their capture did not mean their consent. This anonymous resistance is a vital corrective to a great man view of history. The Mongol Empire was not just Hulegu, Ghazan, and the Noyan on horseback. The empire was also this, a vast, subterranean engine of human suffering and the sparks of defiance that it could never, ever fully extinguish. The legacy is the evidence, hidden in the administrative friction and inferred from the brutal countermeasures, that no system of oppression is ever total. The human will to resist, to assert its own value, will always find a way to fight back, even if it is only with a whisper, a glance, or a well-aimed pickaxe in the dark. The Ilkhanate itself would eventually fracture, its mighty dynastic line collapsing into civil war and fading into the complex tapestry of Persian history. The minds that had demanded such a terrible price fell silent, their shafts flooded, their grim secrets slowly reclaimed by the earth. But the echoes of that struggle, the quiet, desperate assertion of will against overwhelming power, remain. They challenge us to look beyond the monuments and the chronicles, reminding us that true history is so often written not in ink, but in the silent, enduring, and defiant resilience of the human spirit.